Well, welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Sally Blair, Senior Director of Fellowship Programs here at the National Endowment for Democracy. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's presentation, Transparency and the Struggle for Accountability in Mexico, featuring Reagan-Ficell Democracy Fellow Irma Sandoval Ballesteros. We are delighted to have with us as a discussant Eric Hirschberg, Director of the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies at American University. I would also like to say a special welcome to Irma's mother. Mama is here, Senora Ballesteros. Welcome. Funded by the U.S. Congress, the Reagan-Ficell Democracy Fellows Program hosts some of the world's most dedicated democracy activists, scholars, and journalists to conduct independent research and pursue projects here at NED. Now in our 12th year, the program has hosted more than 180 fellows from over 80 countries since its founding in 2001. The beginning of a new presidential administration in Mexico presents an opportune time to assess important aspects of the country's efforts to improve governmental transparency and accountability. A range of reform measures, including freedom of information and anti-corruption legislation enacted during the last 2 decades in Mexico, have strengthened the framework for oversight and control, but implementation and enforcement of these reforms remains problematic. Meanwhile, functions that are typically in the realm of the public sector are increasingly being handled by private corporations, nonprofit organizations, independent contractors, or quasi-governmental entities. Some of the nascent gains achieved in governmental transparency and accountability, therefore, may be undermined by the growing responsibilities that are placed in private sector hands. Most importantly, the ongoing failure to find the right approach to countering corruption is crippling Mexico's ability to meet its evident potential as a regional and even global powerhouse. In her presentation, Dr. Sandoval Ballesteros will explain how this new context of structural pluralism of public authority presents new challenges that require new approaches. She will offer recommendations for developing strategies to expand transparency and anti-corruption policies that can help strengthen democratic institutions and allow Mexico to fully realize its economic potential. Irma Sandoval Ballesteros is Associate Professor at the Institute for Social Research and Director of the Laboratory for the Documentation and Analysis of Corruption and Transparency at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. She is a member of Mexico's National System of Researchers and recipient of the prestigious 2009 Manuel Espinosa Iglesias Award. And international expert on transparency, accountability, and political economy, she has published over 24 book chapters and articles in peer-reviewed journals. Her most recent books include Crisis, Rentismo y Intervencionismo Neoliberal en la Banca, Mexico, 1982-1999, and Contemporary Debates on Corruption and Transparency, Rethinking State, Market, and Society. She has served as a senior consultant to the World Bank, UNDP, Global Integrity, Open Society Institute, and the Budget Accountability Project. She is also currently a research fellow at the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies at American University, which gives me a good segue to introduce today's discussant. We're delighted to have Eric Hirschberg here with us, Director of the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies and Professor of Government at American University. Previously, he served as Program Director at the Social Science Research Council based in New York, as well as President of the Latin American Studies Association. Dr. Hirschberg has taught at Simon Fraser University, New York University, Southern Illinois University, Columbia, Princeton, and the New School. As a seasoned political economist, he has written extensively on development and democratization across Latin America. In addition to several dozen journal articles, he has contributed chapters to a number of volumes, including New Institutions for Participatory Democracy in Latin America, Voices and Consequences, and Left Turns, politics, policies, and trajectories of change in Latin America. He is currently coordinating a multi-volume series on the reconfiguration of elites and power in Central America. We will now turn the floor over to Irma, who will speak for approximately 35 minutes or so, followed by Eric for about 10 minutes. For those of you on Twitter, you can follow this presentation and contribute to the conversation by using the hashtag NEDEvents or by following the endowment @NEDemocracy. If you have not already done so, please join me in silencing your cell phones. And may I take this opportunity to thank staff members Melissa Aiton-Becknell, Ashley Walburn, Sarah Amin, Sukanya Banerjee, Dean Jackson, Mike Crump, and most especially Research Associate Hillary Collins for their help in organizing today's event. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to share with you my ideas, my proposals, and for this great opportunity of exchanging points of view on one of the most important topics on Latin America in general. Thank you. Thank you. I want to start by also thanking, first of all, to Dr. Sally Blair. It has been wonderful to be here, to enjoy this great opportunity of being a fellow, Reagan Fashel Fellow at this important institution. It has been an excellent environment, and I want to thank publicly to Sally and the great staff, Hillary, of course. And in particular, I want to thank publicly Dr. Hirschberg. He's in a great demand right now. He has been traveling all these days, and I'm very honored and happy that he can be with us this morning. I want to talk on this topic. I think that it was an absence, a crucial absence. It was absent in the recent summit, absent from the President Obama recent visit to Mexico to have the summit with our new President Enrique Peña Nieto. The most important absence was a discussion of corruption, of crime, and of human violations, human rights violations in my country. I think that this was very worrisome because this is the #1 problem that we have in Mexico: corruption, crime, and human rights. Systematic corruption, abuse of power, and this institutionalized impunity that we suffer every day in our country is what have this country on the verge of collapse. Really, we truly are in a sort of civil war, and I want to share with you why I sustain this. Sorry, I don't. What number is it? F7?
You just click through? Sure. You can click through here. And then click through the
Okay, thanks. Yeah. So, well, you have there the map. During the 6 years of the Felipe Calderón administration, we have a lot of deaths, as you must know. But the official statistics that we have for this year, for this period of the new government of Enrique Peña Nieto, are also very worrying. For example, during the first quarter of 2013 of this year, there has been 380 reported kidnappings, and this is the highest level of kidnappings during a 3-month period over the last 13 years. During the administration of former President Felipe Calderón, the worst period was that of the year 2011. in which we had at some point 335 kidnappings. But Peña Nieto has already surpassed or overcome, increased this number by 45 additional cases during his very first 3 months, his very first quarter. On average, during these first 3 months of 2013, at least 4 people have been kidnapped every day, and more than 100 of these cases have happened during each month. So those are terrible crimes, terrible statistics, and they have been concentrated in states, very interesting states. The state of Tamaulipas, that as you might know is in the border with the US, right? Tamaulipas. The state of Mexico, that is also a very famous state because it's the home state of our current president, Enrique Peña Nieto, and the state of Michoacán, that is also very interestingly the home state of our former president, Felipe Calderón. So all those 3 states are now governed, ruled by the PRI, as you know, also the old authoritarian party of the institutional revolution. And we cannot talk about corruption, accountability, and the struggle for transparency without talking about this truly humanitarian crisis that we are facing in the country. This humanitarian crisis is tearing apart Mexico. We have had at least 70,000 violent deaths, executions, 25,000 disappeared, and 250,000 internally displaced people in my country only over a period of 6 years, over the last 6 years. So these terrible numbers, I would say, are the clearest example of the profound ineffectiveness, the profound failure of our democracy, of our incipient democracy, of our institutions, and of course of our contemporary struggles for accountability. We might think, it's tempting to think that the cause for this explosion of this violence is basically concentrated in the so-called war on drugs undertaken by President Felipe Calderón, who, by the way, is no fellow at Harvard University, as some of you might know. But I think that the real underlying reason, or the most important reason of this terrible violence, has to do precisely with this situation, this impunity rate that we have in Mexico, in which only 5 of every 100 crimes of this type, kidnappings and violent deaths, are ever punished in Mexico. So along with this impunity rate, of course, we have the problem of corruption in itself that invades, that is part of the very roots of our public institutions in Mexico. This impunity rate is not something of the past, as the current administration would like us to believe. Is, as I was telling you at the beginning, with these statistics, these terrible statistics, it continues happening right now, today. And is something that we cannot talk of corruption without dealing with this issue, and that's why I think that it was a clear absent from our presidential summit a few days ago. But well, not everybody in Mexico is as bad. We are a country of great potential. We are a country that, as you can see from these numbers, we are a Latin American potency. We are the second most important Latin American economy in the hemisphere after Brazil. And also we are in a very good position at the international level. I mean, number one is the big guys, okay? I mean, we cannot, we don't have like elements to compare with them, but then we are the 14th most important economy. We are the 14th largest economy of the world. We have vast natural resources. We have sophisticated human capital. We have a very high rate of studios among the population. I mean, we have a lot of potential. We have a powerful oil industry, vast petroleum reserves. We have gold, silver, enormous biodiversity. I mean, we have everything. And importantly, most importantly, we have an incredible past of great civilizations and of great history. And the most important resource of this is, of course, the more than 150 million of hardworking, well-trained and sophisticated, inspired people that we have in my country. But Mexico, as I was trying to explain, is also a country of terrible contradictions. At the beginning of the 20th century, we had an important revolution, the Mexican Revolution, who brought about a very important constitution, the 1917 Constitution, that set the standard for progressive state building in the world. We were the first constitution to include as a right, as a constitutional right, the right to work, the right to education, the right to land, and the right to healthcare. This constitutional model that emerged out of the Mexican Revolution would later be taken up by the great social constitutions of Europe later in history. Yet, in spite of all this normative, constitutional, and historical potential, Mexico continues being one of the most unequal countries in the world. 10 families, including that family of Carlos Slim Lu, the wealthiest man in the world, control 10% of all this richness, of all this GDP, 10% of the GDP. And more than 50% of the population survives in poverty. So between 2000 and 2010, we have experienced in my country a sort of lost decade. According to the Mexico National Institute for Statistics, growth averaged only 1.7% over these years that I'm telling you. Whereas Brazil, that is the most important Latin American potency, and Argentina, of course, Colombia, Venezuela, and even other countries of Latin America, such as Bolivia, El Salvador, of less potential, of less resources, have done much better over the same period. So in a way, we are clearly underperforming with all the potential, with all the human resources that we have. We are in a lost decade. It was very funny. 2 days ago, the Nobel Prize Paul Brookman came to Mexico to give a lecture to some important event, and he said something very funny. He said, everything in Mexico works perfect except for the rate of growth. Minor detail. I didn't understand if he was being serious or ironic about this. Of course, everything works perfect in the economy, he said. Everything works perfect in the economy. I mean, he was looking, of course, at the control of inflation or some other important measures. But he said the rate of growth is a disaster. And that's the core of our contradiction. So a similar trajectory of paradoxes and contradictions has taken place in the area of transparency and in the area of the combat of corruption, combating corruption. On the one hand, Mexico is at the forefront of very important constitutional reforms and at the forefront of institutional and legal design for accountability. We have, for example, a very highly developed normative framework to confront corruption, because our criminal code, for example, is a good example, it complies with the highest international agreements. Insofar we include a lot of different types of corruption, over a dozen of different kinds of extortion, abuse of power, conflicts of interest. I mean, we have a clear repertoire of different types of corruption. We also have one of the most important Freedom of Information Acts in the world. Our FOIA is well known for having included a strong procedural guarantees to make the public and to make the citizen to have the information fast, and we have also a very sophisticated and excellent institutional design in terms of transparency. Our Access to Information Commission is relatively independent, and of course it is supposed to function both as a court to reviewing and the right to access to information, and also this body, this institution, this agency is supposed to work to promote and to strengthen the culture of transparency. I mean, as a sort of a ombudsman in charge of strengthening our culture of transparency, both in the government and in the rest of society. So the right to access to public information is also included in this constitution that I was telling you is a very important constitution. And very importantly, our Mexican Constitution, when it backed our right to have access to public documents and to have access to public information, state that all governmental agencies and all governmental institutions have to grant free access to information or to government documents under the principle, and this is important, under the principle of maximum publicity when they interpret the Freedom of Information laws and law. But again, all these advances, all this sophistication at the normative, legal, and even constitutional level is not correlated with a advance in policy. The problem is that these achievements have fallen short as real tools to fight corruption, to confront impunity, and to really pave the way towards a more accountable government. And here are also the facts, the statistics, no? The most recent corruption and basic facts on our failure in confronting corruption. For example, you can see there that in last year, 2012, Mexico received 34 out of 100 points, which put us at the level of Egypt and below the level of countries like Mali, Bolivia, Senegal, Gambia. I mean, and I'm not saying that this in a I don't want to sound adherent to the modernization theory per se, but I'm saying that we have a lot of normative and political and economical resources to be rated by our own citizens in these poor terms. Also, the victimization rates are very clear. No, the America's barometer went up between 2008 and 2010. And what these numbers are showing is that democratization or process of democratization, the recent process of democratization have not yet translated into a more effective government or more effective way of doing politics of government. So I think that what explains this is that we in Mexico, well, not we, the government in Mexico has not had a good diagnosis of the real problem of corruption. In Mexico, the policy against the anti-corruption policy has been framed under a very specific and problematic model of understanding and confronting corruption. And corruption is not just a question of low-level public servants using or filling their pockets at the expense of common citizens. Corruption is not just a question of culture, of democracy. It is very revealing, for example, that Samuel Huntington, as you know, the most important figure, scholar figure of the theory of the modernization, once the optimistic herald of worldwide democratization, it is very interesting that he ended up being a pessimistic prophet of the clash of civilizations. I think that this is because Huntington, or the Huntingtonian take on development and democratization in general, or what is also known as modernization theory, is a form of economic determinism that really leaves very little room for a more complete or more coherent understanding of societies and processes. So one of my principal premises that I want to share here with you today is that it is time to put behind us both modernizationist approaches to corruption and also culturalistic or moralistic conceptions which focus on the only on the cultural roots of the problem of corruption. That's something that it is not giving a good result. I mean, recent war has demonstrated that corruption is hugely important in Mexico or in Latin America or in the so-called developing world, as is important here in the US, in Europe, in China, in all the big guys I was showing you in the past lamina. See, I mean, corruption is not a question of culture, it's not a question of development, it's a question of what is in the second premise, is root in the dynamics of state-society relations, and we need to understand what is happening at that level to really confront corruption. So we should also move beyond those bureaucratic approaches to corruption with focus only or exclusively on the administrative culture and emphasize only on technological solutions or organizational improvements. And of course, the question is that corruption is an institutional, a social and institutional and political problem which require equally institutional, structural, and political participatory solutions that we haven't had, unfortunately, in my country. And the third premise is that corruption is not only a question of the state, is not only a question of the public sector, is not that old malady of bureaucracies, but it's also, and perhaps first of all these days, a question that involves the private sector. Private individuals and corporations are simultaneously victims and active agents of corruption. It will do no good to resolve corruption or to resolve the supply side of this problem of corruption through civil service reform, through oversight in a traditional and typical approach, and transparency only at a minimalistic level, if we don't address the other side of the problem, the demand side of corruption, by controlling precisely, by punishing, and by overseeing and promoting ethics for private actors and forces who really benefit from and actively promote corruption. So this is particularly important, I would say, given the fact that these days in Mexico and everywhere, the social functions that were typically developed and done by the public sector are increasingly being handled by private corporations, non-profit organizations, and also the independent contractors. We have a problem that I've called a kind of an outsourcing opacity in that regard. And so regardless of what is our opinion on those trends, on these kind of semi-privatization processes or this process of privatization, I think that regardless of our personal opinion of these processes, it is time to pay attention to these new actors, to these elements of that need to be bring accountable in the public sector. So in order to do that, I'm proposing a new structural corruption approach that focuses more, or that pay attention not only at the traditional bribes, but that pay attention more at the capture of the state or at the important conflicts of interest that these are happening at the most at the highest levels in Mexico and in other states. We need, again, to go beyond that exclusive focus on payoffs, on bribes, and bureaucratic reforms, and we need to reorient our energies towards the combat of these most important elements, like capture of the state, conflicts of interest, top officials involved in conflicts of interest. A good example of this, in Mexico, we have numerous independent regulatory agencies that, unfortunately, are in most of the cases staffed by political appointments or commissioners who are not really technically prepared or with the expertise, the needed expertise, and political appointees that have long careers, political careers within political parties. So it is almost impossible, I would even say almost impossible, to find civil society leaders or to find independent experts in these different and numerous independent regulatory agencies. And a very clear example is our Federal Telecommunication Commission, who was headed by a ex-senator of the right-wing party, the Acción Nacional party, that had a clear link to the media giant Televisa, and other members of that commission were also very close with the Televisión Azteca, other media giant that we had in Mexico. And I must mention in this case, by the way, that you guys are following our steps in this regard by the most recent nomination of, I understand, a former lobbyist for the cable and cell phone industries at some important corporations here as the head of the Federal Telecommunication Commission in this country. So it's a good example of how this structural corruption that we need to look at, or we need to pay much more attention, is affecting not only Latin America or the underdeveloped world, but is taking place everywhere else. So the real problem, I'm saying, is not so much the low-level bribery of innocent people here and there by policemen or by bureaucrats, but the structural corruption that is taking place in the very root of that black box called the state everywhere. So this is hugely important also in countries like Mexico, right, and Latin America, in which we have this concentration of power, and we have also been intimately linked to economic reform and privatization as the solution of all our problems during the 90s. The mainstream perspective of Well, yeah, this is the traditional approach to corruption, the corruption as the monopoly of public action plus discretion minus accountability. And I'm proposing this structural approach in which corruption should be understood as the abuse of power, either public or private, but abuse of power plus impunity, or the rate of impunity that we have in countries like mine, minus the citizen participation that we should have as a real answer to confront corruption. Then we have put in question also a very important theoretical tenet of the solutions for development in Latin America. The mainstream perspective told us that economic liberalization and political liberalization would work in a synergy, or would come one with the other. And what we have seen in these years is all the contrary. Privatization or this supposedly economic liberalization, the so-called economic liberalization, has led to more corruption in Mexico and in many countries of the region. Privatization has worked as a transfer of rent from public to private sector. After that, then we had to look for solutions of this, and the bailouts came, and the bailouts that would work to resolve the very first problem end up being a distribution of private losses to public hands by rising up the public debts. And that, of course, has led to increased concentration of wealth. That led us also to the undermining of political and electoral processes through boycotting and electoral fraud. And in the end, I would put in question at least that synergy of the so-called consensus package and say that what had happened in my country and in many areas is that the so-called liberalizing economic reforms have led us to more corruption. In the end, I would say even that neoliberalism, at least in Mexico, has worked not as an economic orthodoxy with political consequences, but fundamentally as a political project that played out through economic policy initiatives. This privatization as a transfer of rents from public to private sector can be completely explained or reflect in the figure, or more than in the figure, in the wealth of Carlos Slim. Mexico is now, as you know, the home of the wealthiest man of the world. He has been the main beneficiary of all this process of privatization. He's the owner of everything. He controls. Yeah, it is very funny. As you might know, you guys are not the only United States of the hemisphere. Our official name as country is not Mexico. It's the United States of Mexico. And there has been a proposal to change the name and to say that it's not anymore the United States of Mexico, but the United States of Carlos Slim. I mean, Carlos Slim is in charge of, it controls and has everything: industry, finance, banks, commerce, real estate, and it's not only it's not controlling only Mexico, but even the New York Times. I understand that some sport team, he or his cousin, he bought a Patriots. I don't remember what, but he's a great example of these political and economic creatures of neoliberalism in Mexico. So the privatization process, what I'm trying to say, the only thing I want trying to say with this is the privatization process ended up being more transfer of rents in control of the state, in the hands of the state, to the hands of other powerful actors such as Carlos Slim and few other actors that control the economy and now the politics in Mexico. So this connection between bribery or corruption in general and the private sector that have me that it's of my one of my principal concerns is particularly clear in the recent case of Walmart. Also, I mean, we can mention many other cases, right? With you guys had the Enron, the WorldCom bubble. We also recently had this case that involves both countries, Mexico and the U.S., by the way, that is the HESBC laundry money case that we had. I mean, this connection between corruption and the private is something that we cannot deny anymore if we really want to confront corruption as a problem that is threatening development and that is threatening democracies in general. In the case of Walmart, it was terrible because we had hundreds of illegal bribes in very short period of time. And that was followed by cover-up by high top executives, both in Mexico and also here in the main offices of Walmart. And this implicated a lot of an important amount of money, as you can have there. The most interesting case of this Walmart is that during the Calderon administration, Walmart was given 2,000 new governmental contracts. And only during 1 year, in 2011, Walmart was granted with 365 permits to open new stores. I mean, this incredibly expansion that we had in our country equal to the amount of opening one new store a day during this year, 2011. And the most terrible part of this, and sometimes these Walmart stores were opened in places prohibited by the law, even by the Constitution, such as environmental areas, such as areas reserved for the construction of schools, of hospitals, of archaeological sites. This was very insulting for most of Mexicans when Walmart had succeeded in opening a new store in the same, well, not the same, but very close to the Pyramid of the Sun. I don't know if you guys have been in Mexico, but one of the most important archaeological sites that make us feel proud as Mexicans is La Pirámide del Sol in Teotihuacan. Well, the Pirámide del Sol in Teotihuacan had immediately next door, this horrible Walmart store, threatening not only the value, the archaeological value of the land in there, but threatening us as country, as nation, and as culture. And this is, again, I think, very, very bad news. And impunity is there. Impunity is the key there. All this has been widely documented in international press. I'm very sure, well, I believe that a recent Pulitzer Prize was granted to the investigative journalist that brought this case into attention in last month, I believe. So, well, what is proposing Enrique Peña Nieto to confront all this terrible situation of institutionalized corruption? He's proposing more of the same, unfortunately. He's not tackling the issue with a really alternative view on corruption. He even has been accused of being part of this situation. He has been accused of being part of this authoritarian, corrupt, and capture way of doing politics. And many people, particularly the youth in Mexico, believe that he represents the words of the past of the PRI, and particularly most of Mexicans are convinced that his electoral election was not free and fair. There was a lot of cases of boy voting, and of course, the new president is in deep need. He's in need of regaining the legitimacy that he didn't got didn't have at the polls and that he is not enjoying right now. To do that, he's launching 2 new proposals on the subject of accountability. One is the creation of a supposedly independent anti-corruption agency in charge of investigating and preventing corruption. And second is the transformation of our agency, pro-transparency agency. He's proposing to transform this into a supposedly fully autonomous body, since right now this body is still under the control of the executive. But as you know, the devil are in the details, is the saying, right? And although both proposals sound fine on the surface, if we take a closely look at them, we'll see that they are designed actually to cover up instead of real exposing and punishing corruption and opacity. First, I'm going to say just three things of these 2 proposals. The first is that in order to make room for this new anti-corruption agency that Enrique Peña Nieto is envisioning, he is proposing eliminate the Secretary of Public Function. That is our executive agency that was created in 2003 at the peak of our democratic transition after the PRI was kicked off of power, and this Secretary of Public Function was designed to guarantee the application of Mexico's new civil service law. And he's basically saying, we are going to get rid of this. We are going to disappear the Secretary of Public Function, and we are going to broken up the responsibilities of this. Puedes pasarte al otro lado. With my new institution, he's telling us with his proposal. So in other words, what I'm concerned about is that I can do it.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Sorry. So in other words, the problem that we in Mexico see is that the entire it's the elimination of a very important democratic institution that cost us as Mexicans a lot of struggle and effort, and this is going to be a kind of elimination of the entire system of internal control. I mean, he is proposing to eliminate the internal control over professionalization, public spending, the overseeing of public spending. And in a word, in a nutshell, as you say, that we have constructed over the past 50, not that much, 30 years, will be dismantled, will be fragmented, and will be handed over to political operatives close to Enrique Peña Nieto and the main political leaders of this political party. Then one other important element of this is that the new supposedly autonomous anti-corruption agency will be controlled by a so-called the National Integrity Council, or the National Ethics Council that you have there. No, it will be also controlled under a political criteria, and this National Public Council or National Integrity Council will be a political body made up of the 31 state governors. It would have the participation also of the Federal Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of the Interior, the Federal Prosecutor, and most important is that will be preceded or headed by none other than Enrique Peña Nieto himself. So this is a clearly very terrible institutional design that will dismantle all the democratic advances that we had over the last 30 years. And I think that this is a very bad news for the supposed commitment on the fight of corruption that President Peña Nieto can show. And of course, this is also going to be a golden opportunity to create new political alliances, to hand over, to distribute new bureaucratic positions to his friends, to his cronies, to his allies, and this again is not very good news. Well, there are many other elements, technicalities of these institutional reforms that I can share with you, but I will finish just by saying that what we really need is not more of the same. We really need to apply a new, different approach to corruption, a new, different understanding. We need to deep the commitment with democracy, the commitment with empowerment of citizens, a truly effective reform in these areas of accountability and combating corruption would reverse this tendency of institutionalized corruption and corruption by precisely empowering those who are suffering the most the main problems of corruption that are, on the one hand, of course, the citizens, and in particularly those brave souls who are right now in Mexico, the journalists. Journalism is a very important element in our Mexican transition, because we are the most dangerous country in the hemisphere for being journalists. We have a rate of killing of journalists, a very high rate, that equals only the countries like Afghanistan and the like. Well, I finish here. I thank you so much, and I appreciate your attention.
My congratulations, Irma.
Thank you.
And we will have time, I know, in Q&A to talk a little more about your proposals. But first, I would like to turn the floor over to Eric Hirschberg, who will offer his comments. Thank you, Eric.
Okay, thank you very much, Sally. Thank you, Irma. If I can suggest to the young man with the laptop, I'm going to ask at one point for you to show slide 7 and then slide 12. Does that work? Or you don't have that?
I can do.
Okay, sorry about that. I didn't know which computer was connected to what.
Definitely.
Okay, I'm going to try to very briefly touch on 4 points, drawing in part on Irma's presentation and in part on the document that I've seen where she outlines her broader project that she's working on this year. The first point I want to make is something that goes back to some of the earliest of her slides, and we don't need to put them up, which has to do with one aspect of why issues of accountability are so crucial for Mexico, and it has to do with Mexico's economic potential and Mexico's economic context. I agree with Irma that Mexico is a large economy with a great deal of potential. I disagree with her on why it has potential. I don't think it has great potential because of its natural resources. Certainly, that is one factor that can lead us to overcome the circumstance that indeed Paul Krugman describes accurately, which is that despite discussion in a lot of the popular press over the last year or two about Mexico's economic performance being positive, and of course many people have commented on Tom Friedman's piece in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago. Overall, if you look in Latin American context, the last decade or so of Mexican economic performance has been dreadful. It's lagged the rest of the region in terms of growth. It's lagged in terms of productivity and so on. Mexico needs to maintain the rate of growth and expand the rate of growth of the last couple of years. But in order to do so, it needs to boost productivity. In order to do so, it needs greater degrees of accountability, transparency, competition, and so on. And to some extent, that is relevant for the natural resource industry, I would say particularly for Pemex, which needs to be reformed dramatically. That doesn't mean privatized, but there needs to be private capital in Pemex, and there needs to be greater accountability to the managers of Pemex to boost productivity of that important unit of the Mexican economy. At the end of the day, the principal asset that Mexico has, for better or worse, is its integration in North American production networks. And it will take advantage of those opportunities to the extent that it establishes and consolidates institutions that enable greater percentages, greater segments of the population to benefit from the opportunities that that opens up but does not guarantee. And again, that has to do with getting institutions right and getting the relationship between society and institutions right. And that leads me to the second point that I want to make. And here's where slide 7 could be useful. I think that this idea of the structural approach to corruption, is very useful. No, this one, this is good. And I think one of the things that appealed to me when I first saw Irma's outline for this project is that she moves away from a conventional notion that corruption is about culture. Corruption isn't about culture. Corruption is about institutions, and it's first of all the design of institutions, and I think one of the messages we can take from this presentation is that in terms of institutional design, Mexico's not doing so poorly. But there's a second question. It's not just designing institutions, it's developing the capacities to implement what's on paper. If any of you have ever studied how we look at public policies, there's the design phase, but there's also the enactment phase, and there's also the implementation phase, and then there's the ongoing monitoring, right? And Mexico has not made it all the way through those 4 steps. So the design is one thing, but it's secondly the question of the capacity to implement and monitor. That, in turn, is in part a function of the relationships between state and society. And this brings in the question of the capacity of society to hold institutions accountable, right? And I think this, as a frame for thinking about Mexico's challenge, is very productive. And I think it's really important to get us away from cultural explanations. Having said that, I'm not convinced by the way in which you present Mexico in global terms. I mean, the indicators that you use, and they are the ones that are typically used, but I just don't find them persuasive, are the Transparency International stuff, which doesn't, it seems to me, have convincing mechanisms for grappling with differences across countries, for that matter, regions of the world, around levels of development, economic structures, so on and so forth, and the public opinion data, LAPOP and the Barometro. But what people say about corruption doesn't necessarily correlate to what is empirically the case about corruption. And I'll give you an analog. If you look at the public opinion data comparatively for Latin America, you'll find that in a country like Chile, security is seen as the foremost issue. Well, in fact, the security challenges empirically are much less citizen security in Chile than elsewhere. So it's interesting to get what people report as their self-perception, but I don't think it actually necessarily is accurate. And so when I look at, do I believe that the problems of accountability and transparency are greater in Mexico than they are in Egypt? No. I'm not sure I agree that they're greater in Mexico than they are in Bolivia. So anyway, that's just a second point. Third point, the initial version of your project has 2 different approaches to corruption and accountability, and you add a third in this presentation, and I think they're all important, but I want to try to unpack them. One has to do with what appears on the surface to be a paradox, which is that as regime transitions happen, that is to say, as we move from non-competitive or authoritarian political systems into more competitive, or we can call them electoral democratic systems, that it appears counterintuitive that corruption and concentration of resources, accountability, all move in a direction that we might not have expected, that there seems to be increases in corruption, that there's concentration of resources, and so on and so forth. So I don't find that surprising at all. That's a sign of institutional instability, and institutions that governed distributions of resources, that provided some degrees of often incomplete and imperfect accountability, those break down, and there's a period of time, at least, before new institutions emerge and before societies develop the capabilities to make those institutions work. And so if you look at transitional systems like Russia, like Mexico, like most of the Latin American countries that underwent simultaneous political and economic transition, South American countries, political and economic transition during roughly the 80s and 90s, this was a pattern that was fairly common, and it's not surprising. The question really is whether over time those new democratic systems design proper institutions, develop the capabilities to implement them, and society evolves in a way so as to hold people accountable, right? I don't find surprising at all that the first dozen years of Mexican democracy is a period in which we see all kinds of signs of corruption, or the period in which someone like Carlos Slim can amass massive amounts of resources. It's a Mexican version of something that we see pretty typically. The second kind of accountability impunity issues that you raise, and to me this is the most exciting thing about your project, is the question of what happens during the last, let's say, 15 or 20 years of the 20th century and the first years of this one, when many functions of economic governance are transferred from the public sector to the private sector or to public-private kinds of spaces. How do the accountability mechanisms therefore have to change, right? Because there are kinds of public functions that we know how political systems, at least in principle, regulate them and ensure transparency in them. When you move those into the private sphere, there's new sets of challenges with regard to how you're going to govern them. I mean, we see that not just in transitional polities and economies. I was reading something just last night on the plane about the privatization of about the private prison companies that run deportation centers, right? I mean, we have vast numbers of people in privately held prison systems without access to lawyers because they're in deportation proceedings, so they don't have rights to lawyers, and so on and so forth. And we don't have the same kinds of mechanisms that in principle, if not always in practice, we would have if these were conventional public detention facilities. So it's just an anecdote. But the point is that structural problem is really interesting, really challenging, I think is something that ought to be the focus of attention. Now, the third kind of issue of accountability and corruption that you bring in, and you then introduce, I think very importantly, the concept of impunity, is what you began with in this presentation, which is the question of violence, human rights violations, and so on. And that's a whole additional other topic. I guess the point that I would say is I share your sense that at the end of the day, to address those kinds of questions, one cannot remove the notion of impunity from the center of the way we look at it, right? That it's not just about a particular conjuncture of transnational circulation of illicit goods and traffic around those things. There are deeper problems of institutions that generate, reinforce impunity. And in that sense, I think it does fit in your overall frame. Nonetheless, I would say if I were to start with this, that what you've got that's new and important for thinking about the Mexican case, it's that question of the public-private interface. And then the other pieces fit together. Last thing then that I want to say, this is my fourth point, and by the way, just on that, the term you used, outsourcing opacity, is provocative, and that's how I would begin with it. Okay, on the fourth point, this would be slide 12, if you could. Thank you. I think it's the penultimate. In order to assess what may be going on with Peña Nieto, these are the kinds of things I would look at. And, I think it's too early to assess what this government is going to do with regard to accountability, with regard to transparency. Now, you raised some very interesting questions here about whether some institutions that are designed well, that have the kind of design features that we would want in order to increase or deepen accountability, whether those are getting eroded and or replaced by institutions that may not be as ideally designed. That's an interesting question. It's something that I think really does merit attention. I think there's a second question as to whether some of the kinds of institutional innovations that we see under this government may open spaces for accountability where they have been absent over the first 12 years of non-pre rule. And here I think the various initiatives that have been associated with this Pact for Mexico, and I know you have a lot of doubts about the Pact for Mexico on both transparency grounds and others. I think there are some signs there of some very important advances. And just either yesterday or the day before, measures were put forth, again, very preliminary, and they're going to be subjected to the legislative sausage factory and what have you, but for opening up the financial system to a much greater degree than it has been open to a broader array of actors in Mexico's economy. And this goes back to the very beginning of whether Mexico has potential to advance its economy in a way that can serve the citizenry as a whole. If the financial sector is opaque, if the financial sector is inaccessible to small and medium-sized enterprises, and so on and so forth, Mexico will continue to languish, right? And if reforms are put forth that make those systems more open to the whole society, that makes their operation more transparent, and this is not just about privatizing. One of the very interesting features of that discussion, and it's something that Peña Nieto's been talking about since before he came into office, since the transitional period. It's not just about privatizing and about increasing the role and autonomy of the private lenders. It's about building the capacity of the state to help provide credit to a broader range of actors in Mexico's society. A state that is held accountable for how it allocates resources and so on and so forth. So I think that this is a good framework for thinking about it, and that it's one that we can use as we analyze line by line what this government proposes and puts into place over the remainder of the sexennium. Anyway, just some thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric, and that was a terrific compliment to Irma's presentation, and you've laid out a nice framework for us to discuss. I don't know, Irma, if you have any immediate responses, or shall we open the floor and you can add in as you go?
I can try to have an initial exchange because those are, I agree, terrific points that Eric has made, and I would answer by saying three basic points. The first is that I think that we agree and that we are here in a question of state-society relations. That is not a question of development only or solely. It's not a question of culture. It's not a question of regime change. It's a question of a dynamic interaction between the state and society, and that's my main point of disagreement with all the reflection that you have framed, that the relationship between the state society in Mexico is really poor right now, and that even during the years of the right-wing government that we had in the past 12 years, that state-society relations were a little bit more dynamic than the one that it is happening with the. I mean, we have, in a way, the return of our old, the backward, the worst part of our political history. We are not having the return of the technocratic PRI with Salinas and Cedillo and all those guys who studied as technocrats here. I mean, we have the worst part of our political regime. We have our Politburo, our Communist Party back in, and they are not concerned in a healthy relationship with society. That's my take. I think that peace and prosperity in Mexico, and not only in Mexico, but in North America as a region, is best fulfilled, is best served, not by giving Peña Nieto and this Mexican Communist Party or dinosaurs that I see in this government, not by giving them the benefit of the doubt. I think that we need to demand clear, concrete proofs of their commitment with accountability and with the combat of corruption. I think that also this situation of the process of maturation, or a question of time that we need to, it's too early to say things against this government or on the, we can counterpoint this with the deaths. I mean, we are in a terrible situation. I would say at the verge of a civil war. I mean, we have lost more lives than the one that you guys lost in the Vietnam War, no? Most people have died in this so-called war on narco-traffic than the one that you lost in the Afghanistan war, in the Vietnam war altogether. It's almost 70,000 of lives. And if that wouldn't happen, I would be able and open to give the benefit of the doubt to this country, this new government. But I think that we are in a terrible situation, and I truly distrust of the possibility of changing in a healthier way this situation. I think that we really are at the verge. I totally agree with Eric and with you in distrusting the official statistics of Transparency International and these measures, because they have methodological issues, of course. But I think that the real situation is worse than the statistics that they share us. I share with you these numbers because those are the official numbers. But I do believe, I'm convinced that the reality is even worse in my country than the one that the officials are showing. I mean, I really think that Mexico is in a real danger of following the path of Egypt. In so far, I mean, we formally have democratic election. In Egypt also they had democratic election. In Venezuela they had democratic elections. The democracy understood in the electoral through the electoral lens is not enough. And that's why if we applied only a bureaucratic, electoralistic, a modernist view on the state-society relationship, we are going to give way for the flourishment and the more authoritarian politics that are on their way right now. Right? Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Irma. So we have questions. Let us take a few questions from the floor together, and this gentleman standing here, and then we'll go over here.
Hello.
If you could identify yourself. Thank you.
My name is Ricardo Lazo. I am from Panama. I know a little bit of Mexico, but it's a big country and you never end knowing it. I want to congratulate Irma. I think she made a wonderful presentation. And one of the points where Eric also agrees with her is the impunity. In this country, we have corruption, of course, like everywhere else, but you have independent courts, and you have a tradition of respect for the law and the Constitution that we don't have. And in all of Latin America, this is why Irma's presentation seems to me very, very important, because it applies to most countries. And why talk about Latin America? The whole third world. I mean, the exception is democratic countries in Western Europe, US and Canada, and other traditions of Anglo-Saxon policies. But I don't want to extend myself because I can talk for hours about this subject. I want to stress the point that they both coincide, that the lack of courts intervention and the prosecution aspect of corruption is completely lacking in our countries.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This gentleman right here, right in front.
Hi, my name is Jose Manuel Heredia. I am from Mexico. I am studying my master in Georgetown. I remember that once I read that to combat corruption, you need uncorruptible people. And I remember that this author said that there were not enough people to combat corruption in Russia. So the question would be if in Mexico there's enough people to combat corruption, that they are uncorruptible. But I know your answer is going to be yes, because you are an academic and you have to be politically correct. But I am a student and I don't have to be, so I don't think so. I am Mexican and I don't believe that. So I was thinking, do you have any example of any Mexican institution that since it was created was not even destroyed by politicians, it was not corrupt by international companies, it was not destroyed by corruption of the people, any institution by made by Mexican government, because I really don't think so.
Okay, thank you. This gentleman here has been patiently waiting on this side, and then one more there, and then we'll have some conversation. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Alberto Fernandez. And I would say that, Irma, your approach, your structural approach to studying corruption is so innovative. It's a really huge rupture with the common approaches that focus on culture and so on. So I wonder if, my question is whether we can push the structural argument a little bit further in the best tradition of Latin American dependency theory. What if corruption is actually embedded in the model of economic development that the country has been pursuing since the early 90s? What if, unlike the common line that we need to ensure the rule of law because that's what attracts foreign investment, what if there are foreign companies that basically come to Mexico precisely attracted by this lack of enforcement of the Mexican legislation? And I just want to give the example of the maquila industry, where basically, it's always been documented that egregious labor rights violations to working conditions, the right to unionize, and so on and so forth. And back in the 90s, some of Mexican officials were very candid to say, like, it was basically impossible to enforce the labor law because most companies would leave. So the question is, yes, I mean, is the structural approach can be pushed to this level?
Very good. And then this gentleman here.
Good morning. My name is Abdulhamid Ikri. I am from Bahrain and the president of Bahrain Transparency. And after the end of this seminar, it will be my seminar on Bahrain. So I encourage people to stay. There will be some Bahraini sweets too. Well, you mentioned about Carlos Slim. He is not slim. He is very fat with with money. The second is I now in transparency for about 10 years. And I noticed, of course, in addressing corruption worldwide, there are few points I would like. First, it is noticed that there is no strong anti-corruption and transparency civil society movement in Mexico. I have noticed that in Brazil, in Venezuela, even in Peru. This is my first, my impression through interaction. The second is that there is, so why? If there is civil society. The second is there will be a conference in Panama City, and it will be in the heart of Latin America. This is by 2 years there is international conference against corruption by UNCAC, by United Nations, and so on. So I think it is good opportunity for example, for you to voice your ideas. Concerning Eric, you mentioned about the barometer, or it is not, does not reflect the TI I am speaking about, at least about the Transparency International Barometer, which is, and Transparency Corruption Perception Index, which comes annually. Actually, it is put by, well, international organizations, about 12 organizations, including World Bank and so on, and Bank of America and so on. But I think the new thing is that since last year, the local transparency organizations, civil society organizations, contribute to it. It's no more put only by let's say, international corporates or something like that, or financial institutions. So this is a chance to and it has improved, actually. It has improved its reflection on.
Okay, if I may ask you to
My just last point is that what is called fair game. If law is not applied on all, it doesn't work. Anti-corruption, transparency, integrity works, but it should be applied on. I mean, but if you have selective application, then it would not work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for those questions. I think we will have Irma and Eric both may have something to say on a range of the topics raised.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I thank you for your comments and your questions that are more points of reflections and comments than the questions. I agree with the gentleman from Panama and from Mexico that of course impunity is the key today to confront corruption, and in terms of the necessity of have truly different incentives to confront corruption, and your question of you say that it is almost impossible to find in Mexico a clean institution, or over time the corruption has been kind of permanent throughout the political development of history. I would agree, but I would disagree in terms of that we have different kinds of corruption, and in that regard I would I take the point made by both of you and by Carlos and by Alberto and by the gentleman from Bahrain in terms of the different structural corruption that we faced after this change of economic strategies that we had during the 90s and the 80s and the 90s. And that's the point. Right now in Mexico, nobody is openly for privatizing anything. And that's why it is important when we look at the combat of corruption and anti-corruption policy and pro-accountability discourses and practice, we need to pay attention to the unsafe processes or the untext that is in that. Not even Peña Nieto, not even Salinas, not even Carlos Slim is advocating for more privatization. Even when they are the main beneficiaries of these changes that, in my view, are the ones who have led to this new structural corruption in which conflicts of interest, in which the abuse of financial institutions, in which the impunity and in which the conflagration of narco traffics and financial institutions and different mafias and currents are taking place right now. I mean, we are in a very different level and we have a very different nature of corruption right now in Mexico. This is a neoliberal corruption, and nobody is paying attention to that. They tend to think that we have the same culturalistic corruption, the same past state-made corruption, and no, we need to confront the neoliberal corruption that is not a corruption, a capitalist corruption. I don't want you to understand me as a pro-socialist or no. I'm saying it's not an anti-capitalist discourse, but a truly capitalist discourse. Capitalism is about competencia. How do you say competencia? Competition. So capitalism is about competition. Capitalism is about electoral competition. Capitalism is about empowerment of citizens. That's not what our Mexican neoliberalism or the neoliberalism a la Mexicana that we have had from 80s and 90s is offering us. And that's the same project that Peña Nieto is pushing forward right now. He's not advocating for more privatization, but he's the first interested in privatized Pemex. I really agree that it's not a question of economics. It's a question of politics, a question of healthy interaction between state and society, and that we need to confront these ominous and terrible incentives that we have these days. I will leave it like that.
Thank you, Irma. Eric.
Just a couple things. Listening to what Irma was just saying, I'm remembering when I was at Columbia University in the mid-90s, Lula came, and there was a seminar where he was outlining, what the big challenges were facing Brazil. So this is roughly 96, 97, somewhere around there. And his line was, well, we have too much privatization. Too many actors, private actors, control resources that need to be subject to competition and so on. And I think this is a challenge that has faced much of the region over the past couple of decades, is that accountability requires institutions that make competition fair and transparent and so on. And that's clearly one of the challenges that Mexico faces. I think Brazil made important progress on that over the last 20 years. People were very pessimistic about that 20 years ago, and gradually there have been some changes. My guess is that Mexico, I'm a little more optimistic than Irma is about the prospects of Mexico for making some advances as well. I agree absolutely with the comment of the gentleman from Panama about the rule of law. I mean, at the end of the day, if you have functioning courts and you are able to hold actors accountable for their actions, you're much more likely to limit corruption, maximize accountability, so on and so forth. You could even say to have deepened democracy, right? And this then, my last point, the way, the person, was it Heredia from Georgetown? The way you frame it is just not the way, if I understood you correctly, that I would frame it. I mean, you say, are there enough uncorruptible people in Mexico? I think that's just completely the wrong way to think about it. It's back to what Irma's project is trying to overcome, which is this notion that corruption is an issue of culture. It's not about uncorruptible or corruptible people. It's about, do societies have the capacity through their own organized networks or through institutions, state institutions or quasi-state institutions that channel behaviors and hold people accountable for the behaviors? I mean, do those conditions in society and the state prevail so that societies are not plagued by corruption? I do think, in answer to your question, that we can cite many, many instances in Mexico's present and past where accountable institutions have existed, where corruption has not been pervasive. I think it's just completely misleading to think about there's something inherent about Mexico being corrupt. That's not the issue.
Well, I think that this has been an excellent conversation. I want to thank Irma and Eric. What a great team. And to say, Irma, I think you have our encouragement to continue your very important work, focusing perhaps, as Eric says, on your insight on this shift to private, from public to private, the outsourcing of opacity, and your own thinking on the theory and policy mechanisms that can be used to deal with this challenge. So thank you, Irma.
Thank
and all
you,
the best
Sally.
to you. Thank you, Eric.